Good afternoon. Thank you for that warm reception. My name is Bob Elias, and as chairman of the Associated Student Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome you to the 10th lecture of our fall quarter. Gesundheit. Rather than make an elaborate introduction, I would just like to reiterate in the beginning about a column some of you may have seen in the Bruin this morning. If not, we have to strive at this university to allow all speakers, no matter who they are, what they believe in, to speak freely at this campus. However, so we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. All I will say now is that I would like to introduce the senior senator from South Carolina, Senator Strom Thurmond.
Mr. Chairman and my fellow Americans, I'm delighted to be out here. I realize that all people do not have the same viewpoint or the same philosophy. I believe strongly in dissent. You have a right to dissent. You have a right not to agree with me. I do believe in respectful hearings, and I believe you will give that this morning. Thank you. I'm going to speak on a subject which I might call things we all know or think we know. I want to talk to you today about some things we all know, or more correctly, some things we think we know. I say think we know because many of the things we think we know simply aren't so. Somehow, many of the things that we take as basic assumptions and use as the foundation of our actions really don't hold up if we scrutinize them closely. We occasionally have such attitudes. Insofar as we are human, we are bound to make mistakes. In our individual lives, such mistakes probably don't have far-reaching effects. I'm reminded very much of a preacher who was preaching on the imperfections of man. I myself am guilty of many sins of omission and commission. I dare say there's not one among you who even thinks he's perfect, said the preacher. He was appalled when a little fellow timidly arose in the rear of the church and held up his hand. Sir, do you mean to say you think you're perfect? Oh, no, Reverend, I'm just standing up in lieu of my wife's first husband. But in our national life, such mistaken attitudes often become the basis for public policy. They are disseminated far and wide by the news media and opinion makers. They become the topics of current discussion and frequently determine the limits of public debate. Some things are repeated so often, over and over, that most people automatically assume that the statements are true, or at least wise. Some people think that to bring them up and re-examine them is to go beyond the pale of polite society. I intend to examine some of these matters today because I believe that they must be looked at dispassionately. Now that we have just gone through our election period, perhaps we are ready for some nonpartisan talk. So I will take some familiar propositions. We all know them because we have heard them so often on television, read them in the paper, and heard them from the pulpit. Let us look at them one by one. First, poverty causes crime. We all think we know that poverty causes crime. Or to put it another way, environment deprivation is responsible for crime. It is a matter of fact that a high crime rate, particularly for violent crimes, attacks, and burglaries, is associated with low-income areas of those who live in such areas. But I submit that this is a misreading of the facts. Poverty doesn't cause crime. Crime causes poverty. First and foremost, crime causes poverty because the chief victims of such violent acts are poor people. Thus, the innocent victim who is poor pays directly for living in a high crime rate. He may lose his money, his goods, or his life. Moreover, he pays the high social cost of crime, and he is least able to afford it. Directly or indirectly, he pays high taxes because of crime. He pays higher prices for food because of increased shoplifting. He pays for inconvenience and deprivation when arson and rioting destroys his neighborhood. But unchecked crime also causes poverty in another way. To the young especially, it holds out the lure of easy money with little trouble. Instead of acquiring discipline and marketable skills, many youngsters in the ghetto and elsewhere are attracted to crime as the easy way to instant riches. In this twisted logic, their heroes chosen for emulation are those who have made it big in rackets, gambling, drugs, and prostitution. They see such criminals flourishing, and they decide that crime pays. Unfortunately, the state of our criminal justice today favors the criminal. A recent study made in New York City concluded that the chances of going to prison are less than 1 out of 200 for a man committing a felony. The number of felonies in that city have multiplied 3 times during the last decade, while the prison population fell by 1/3. The backlog of cases in New York City's criminal court was estimated at 700,000 cases, or enough to last 2.5 years if no new arrests are made. Today, the criminal has 4 chances in 5 never to be arrested. A person arrested has 5 chances out of 6 not to serve time in prison, although only 5% of those tried are acquitted. Only about 1 criminal in 30 ends up behind bars, but on an average, he serves about 55% of his sentence. Is this the fault of our police departments? I think not. We have more than doubled employment in state and local police departments since 1952, although population has increased only 29%. Expenditures for police work have gone up twice as fast as the national income. Our public safety officers are standing as a thin blue line, sheltering us from criminal anarchy. And I want to say that I think that it takes great courage today to be a policeman. The chief cause of our high crime rate today is the record of the Supreme Court and other courts which over the years have turned criminals loose on technicalities and so twisted the Constitution that it is extremely difficult to convict an ordinary criminal. During recent hearings before a subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I had occasion to ask some of the top police chiefs of the nation what was the one thing that could be done to reduce the crime rate. To a man, they all agreed that it would be swift apprehension, speedy justice, and certain punishment. The Supreme Court decisions must and eventually will be modified, then our crime rate will come down. Next, our national priorities must be reversed. Still another thing that we all think we know is that we are spending too much on defense and not enough on welfare, with the conclusion that our national priorities must be reversed. This idea assumes that we are spending too much on the Vietnam War and often leads to the corollary. And often leads to the corollary that if we were to pull out of Vietnam immediately, we would have billions more to spend on welfare. Now, this is simply based upon an ignorance of government finance. The real problem with government spending is that outgo has continued to surpass income, with the resultant debt and inflation. However, spending as such merely kept pace with the gross national product and personal income. In the past 10 years, they all approximately doubled. Since 1952, they all tripled. In the past 10 years, federal civilian employment grew 17%, which parallels the private employment growth rate of 18%. So again, the growth of the federal government is merely keeping pace with the growth of the nation. But these federal figures do not take into account the fact that most welfare programs are funded on the federal level, but are carried out operationally on the local level. To get a good picture of the growth of government, we have to look at the whole employment picture, federal, state, and local. Here we see that since 1952, all government employment has increased by 90%, or 3 times the nation's growth rate. In other words, while federal employment was increasing at the same rate of growth as the nation, government as a whole was increasing at 3 times the rate. Much of this was the result of federal funds and federal incentives. When we look at the federal budget, we see a similar development. The budget has been growing at about the same growth rate as the nation. But within the budget, a dramatic shift has occurred. In relative terms, defense spending has been almost cut in half since 1952. Defense fell from 66% of the total budget to 36%, from 13.6% of the gross national product to 7.2%. Meanwhile, spending for domestic public services since 1952 jumped from 17% to 47% of the budget. Outlays for education, health, and welfare have multiplied 12 times, while all other domestic purposes increased only 3 times. Thus, both relatively and in real terms, our priorities have been long since reversed. In terms of effort, defense spending has been cut in half, while welfare expenses have ballooned. In actual terms, the defense budget in fiscal year 1969 was $81 billion, while non-defense outlays were $103 billion. The defense figures include the cost of the Vietnam War. Over the past decade, the defense budget has remained at around 9% of the GNP. What this means, then, is that the cost of Vietnam has been paid for out of the regular defense budget. It means that our normal defense needs have not been met. It means that research and development plans have been cut back. It means that our weapon systems have not been modernized. It means that our military preparedness has been set back a decade. Our reckless plunge into welfare has brought our national security to the brink of disaster. The next point. The United States is the strongest nation in the world militarily. Another thing we all think we know is that we don't have to worry about a military threat to our power because the United States is the strongest nation in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say to you that we can no longer speak with such self-confidence. Our plunge into unprecedented welfare spending has forced us to cut back on our investment in defense preparedness. The cost of the Vietnam War has not been paid at the expense of social welfare programs, but at the expense of our general preparedness. The daily cost of fighting the war has prevented us from undertaking the development of new programs and new weapon systems. We are saddled today with the results of McNamara's cutbacks in research and development made 6, 7, and 8 years ago. Development is not something that can be turned on and off like a tap. It must be an ongoing effort. Even if the progress of the war enables us to dramatically reduce expenditures for Vietnam, we will have immediately begun work on programs to catch up on our preparedness defense effort. In fact, if we want to survive as a free nation, we will have to make this effort even if it means cutting back on the augury welfare spending. The fact is that the Soviet Union has made a determined effort in the past 10 or 12 years to achieve military superiority over the United States. In some fields, they have already reached their goal. In 1975, they could be superior in every field. While the Soviets have been putting forth this effort, the United States effort has declined. Today, in actual terms, the Soviets are spending 25% more than the United States for military research and development. They are spending $12 billion a year more for military hardware. In relative terms, the Soviets are spending twice as high a percentage of their gross national product for their entire military machine as the United States is spending. Let us look only at two interrelated items: the Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile system and the Soviet missile-carrying submarine fleet. Secretary of Defense Laird announced at the beginning of this month that the Soviets have 1,400 ICBMs as opposed to our 1,054. By 1975, the Soviets will have 1,600. We have no plans to add any. But it is not enough to look at mere numbers. The type of missiles is important. The Soviets are continuing to deploy their gigantic SS-9 super missiles, missiles so large that their only purpose can be to destroy American ICBM sites. By 1975, the Soviets will have enough SS-9 missiles to do this. We have no missiles of this type. Now let us look at the Soviet submarine fleet, which has been designed for mastery of the seas and control of all sea traffic. The Soviet submarine fleet is 2.5 times larger than ours. Almost all have been built during the past decade, while the American fleet is 16 to 20 years old on average. Our momentary advantage lies in our 41 Polaris submarines, each one of which carries 16 Polaris missiles launched from underwater. The Polaris missile has a range of 2,800 miles. The Soviets have only 28 submarines of this type. However, they are building one a month and will surpass us by 1974. From the East Coast, the Soviet submarine launch missile could hit any American city as far inland as Denver or further. This puts into focus the recent controversy over the submarine base the Soviets were building in Cuba. Such a base would not only aid the Soviet missile submarines in maneuvering off our coast, but would enable them to maintain and service the delicate mechanisms of the missiles in port. This is a provocation potentially as serious as the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. I believe that the Soviets were testing us to see how far they could go. If we had not resisted, they would be completing that base today. Moreover, I fully believe that they will attempt to build such a base again as soon as they feel they are strong enough to get away with it. Even though our missile forces remain theoretically capable of a retaliatory second strike, we must not think of the confrontation solely in terms of an ultimate nuclear holocaust. The Soviets are prudent. They press their advantage only as far as they can go without retaliation. There are many levels of confrontation below a nuclear exchange. Even if the Soviet nuclear power is never used, it gives them psychological and diplomatic leverage in extorting concessions and in swallowing up the weaker countries of the world. Thus, bit by bit, the Soviets will chew away at the world, the Middle East, Latin America, even Western Europe, forcing the non-communist world to come to communist terms. The drive for Soviet superiority forces us to face a double threat: the threat of actual welfare on our soil, and the threat of communist encirclement of a United States gradually growing weaker. Therefore, I believe that we will have to face up to some hard decisions, expensive decisions. For example, we will have to put on a crash program for the development and construction of the undersea long-range missile system known by its initials as ULMS. This program will require a larger submarine than the Polaris, with a cruising range of several thousand miles. Its missiles will have a range of up to 6,800 miles instead of 2,800. It will be able to dive deeper and remain on station longer. Geography has played a crucial trick on us. Our cities and military targets are exposed on the coast of a relatively small continent. Land targets in the Soviet Union are protected by Siberia on one side and Western Europe on the other. Without the additional range of the ULMS, we cannot be sure of hitting our principal strategic targets in the Soviet Union from the sea. If the Soviet Union continues its drive for superiority, we will have no option but to strengthen our own defenses. We must be prepared to spend from between $10 and $15 billion over the next 8 years on the ULMS. We will have to step up our deployment of the Safeguard anti-ballistic missile system. We will have to sacrifice many of the political luxuries in our budget to ensure our survival. Another point, negotiations will bring us peace. Another thing that we think we all know is that negotiations will bring us world peace. This is indeed a comforting thought, and one that is backed by high-minded motivation and noble sentiments. There is something reassuring about the idea that magnanimous concessions by the world's strongest power will result in permanent arrangements for the security of all peoples. There are two fallacies in this line of reasoning. The first is that we no longer have a monopoly on strategic superiority, and the second is that we have no proof that the Soviets actually want peace. Throughout history, we note that peace comes through negotiations. Only when the lesser side is defeated decisively in war and desperately needs peace. Unfortunately, neither the Soviets nor their communist allies have ever suffered decisive defeat, nor have they ever given up their desire to dominate the world. In addition, they know they have nothing to fear from the United States. The Soviets negotiate for tactical reasons only. They negotiate to slow down or hinder actions which may strengthen the West. Nor do they hesitate to break such treaties when the tactical advantage for them has disappeared. A study made some years ago showed that the Soviets had negotiated some 2,500 treaties in the course of 40 years, and that the Soviets had broken faith at least once with every country involved. The more important the treaty, the more likely the Soviets are to break it. In fact, the breaking of treaties is an instrument of Soviet national policy. We also have a consular treaty with the Soviet Union, which is supposed to give us immediate access to United States citizens held by Soviet authorities. Yet a few days ago, when two United States generals flying in a light plane which accidentally strayed off coast from Turkey into Soviet territory, the Soviets pointedly denied access for 8 days, itself a violation, and then refused further access. They relented only when the United States State Department sent a note of protest formally charging the USSR with breaking the treaty. If the Soviets break faith on such a trivial incident, is it likely that they will adhere to a treaty regulating the balance of strategic power? The Soviets enter such negotiations as the SALT talks now going on in Helsinki with a different attitude. We send specialists in arms control and disarmament, men who have dedicated their lives to achieving disarmament, such as Gerard Smith, Averill Harriman, Harold Brown, Paul Nitze, and Llewellyn Thompson. The Soviets send practically no one but seasoned military professionals. The head of the Soviet delegation, Vladimir Semkonov, has been the Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister for 15 years, and before that was a political advisor to the top Soviet military strategists, Marshal Zhukov and Sokolovsky. To assist him, he brings about 2 or 3 three-star generals, a couple of major generals, and several colonels. In other words, while we send disarmament experts, the Soviets send armament experts. Is it any wonder that the only effect of the SALT talks is to produce political propaganda in the United States on behalf of those who want to cut back on our preparedness programs? We have had over 5,000 disarmament meetings of various types with the Soviets since World War II, and we have yet to reach an enforceable on-site inspection agreement on any strategic weapon. The Soviets at the present time are asserting that the balance of power between the East and the West has shifted in favor of the Communists. Even a year ago, at the International Communist and Workers' Parties meeting in Moscow, the theme that the balance of power had already shifted was the dominant note of the meeting. The discussion was about how to make this shift of power irreversible. Quite obviously, the Communists were speaking in advance of the facts, but they are laying their plans now for the period of 1974-75, when their superiority may in fact be irreversible if nothing is done by the United States. It is true that we are in an age of negotiation, but we must not fail to recognize that negotiation is part of the confrontation. The peace table is but an extension of the battlefield. Another point. Our youth are rejecting traditional American values. Another thing that we all think we know is that our young people are rejecting traditional American values. Many of these very youths agree, yet I am not sure what it is that the young people of America are rejecting. After 25 years of liberalism in our schools and pulpits, I doubt that many have had the opportunity to become truly acquainted with our traditions. If the young people are rejecting materialism, I also reject materialism, which excludes intellectual or spiritual values. If the young people are rejecting hypocrisy, I also reject hypocrisy. If the young people are rejecting the dehumanization and pollution of our society, I also reject dehumanization and pollution. If the young people demand that dissent be heard, I would like to point out that in my political career, I have never been afraid to dissent from the prevailing attitudes and policies, and I have found that those who speak up can be heard. But having said this, I cannot agree that America is corrupt and decadent at the core. I cannot believe that human beings at this time and place are fundamentally any better or any worse than in any other period or locality. If something has gone out of American life in some circles, that something is respect for traditional values. Instead of morality, they practice relativism. Instead of courage, they resort to pragmatism. Instead of patriotism, they have a negative rejection of the heritage of our homeland and history. This is the fruit of the alien doctrine of liberalism, which calls into question our basic religious tenets, which rejects absolute moral principles, and which reduces mankind to the one dimension of the here and now. I can fully understand why some of our young people dissent from such a bankrupt social philosophy. The problem is that too many of our young people are seeking solutions which are merely extensions of the same liberal philosophy. The use of drugs merely substitutes a destructive material response to a spiritual hunger. The collapse of sexual morality and the prevalence of obscenity and pornography is a prime cause of the dehumanization and degradation of human life. The cry for peace when basic human values are under attack is a surrender to the forces which are calling for the extension of human values. Therefore, when I reject materialism, I reject the philosophy that government can successfully manipulate society, eliminate poverty, or alleviate alleged social injustice based upon private choice. When I reject hypocrisy, I reject the theory that man is fundamentally directed by economic drives and shaped by his environment. The physical pollution of our society is something that we can handle if we bend our efforts to it. But we must not allow pollution control to become the excuse for increased government control over our personal lives, our legitimate free choices, the education of our children, and even over the power of life and death itself. I can think of no greater dehumanization of life than a society where arbitrary governmental decisions restrict and distort the most intimate affairs of personal and family life. I do not think that young people are rejecting traditional American values, because in recent years, traditional American values have been cast aside by the so-called liberal forces in our society. I call upon those who are confused and disillusioned by this situation to go back to the noble elements and principles of our traditions and find their inspiration there. Let us pause then, in conclusion, to think about these things that we think we know and realize how little we actually know about them. Let us look beyond the rigid assumptions of popular discussion and try to understand where the greatness of our nation is founded. The things that we think we know are often the greatest block to our understanding. Thank you very much.
All right, let's go straight into the questions and answers. We have people with microphones. If you'll raise your hand, they'll come to you. Let's start on that side over there. I can't see.
Okay. Senator Thurmond, you touched on a couple of points in your speech. One, pragmatism,
Excuse me,
and
just
the
a
other,
minute.
environmental factors.
Can we turn these lights off?
Senator Thurmond,
No,
well,
see,
these
this way
aren't-
we can
these aren't-
see you
I
too.
came prepared with questions for you, dealing with something else, but you touched on two things in your speech which I'd like to ask first. One thing, you mentioned pragmatism, and it's an alien philosophy. Pragmatism is a strictly homegrown philosophy from one of the James brothers. I think it was William James. Secondly, you talked about environmental factors not being important. Then you decried the loss of moral character in America. If moral character is not an environmental factor, I'd like to know what is. You can't have environment both ways. Moral character is part of it. I think you've got to talk about, if you're going to talk about the ghetto, you've got to talk about it there, environment there too. Okay, the questions I came prepared with. Do you, sir, oppose home rule for the District of Columbia because District of Columbia is now a black city? And secondly, would you condone a staff member of yours who, when approached by a black law student from George Washington University seeking your aid for a D.C. narcotics control program, told him, 1, either he is stupid or ignorant to approach you for anything, 2, this country is a white man's country, 3, the justice, the law, and the law of this land are intended only for the white man? Would you condone these statements of your speechwriter?
I don't want to use strong language, but whoever said that I said that or my staff member said that is a lie. I want to make this position clear. We might as well understand each other. You may not agree with me, but I've got a right to my thinking and my opinion, and if you've got any guts, you listen to me. I believe in equal opportunities for everyone. I believe in equal rights for everyone. And I have not made any statement against any race in my lifetime. Now, the question you asked there is about pollution. I have supported the pollution bills in the Congress of the United States. I believe in taking measures to prevent pollution. This generation and the next generation and generations to come must be protected. Our environment must be protected. There's no question about that. The point I'm making is that we must be on guard to prevent government regulation and regimentation from going so far as to destroy our freedom and our liberty and our private lives. Now, the next point he raised is about the District of Columbia. I have not voted for the District of Columbia bills, because the Constitution set aside 10 square miles in the District of Columbia for the seat of government. It's under the control of Congress. You may not agree with me. Some people don't. A great many do. I think it should remain under the Congress because you might have some local government that might be in conflict with the Congress. This is the seat of government, and I feel that it should remain under the Congress.
All right, can we have the next question from this side?
Yeah, Senator Thurmond. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your courage for coming today.
Well, I want to say this. Frankly, I want to say this to you students at UCLA. I was advised by 9/10 of the people who talked to me about this not to even come and talk here today. I was told that there would be such a militant minority that they wouldn't let you talk. I was told that you were unreasonable and wouldn't listen to people. But I didn't believe that. I came here because I've got confidence in you, and I've got confidence in the youth of this country. I believe the majority of the young people of this country think right, and I believe they want to hear both sides of a question.
All right, let's continue with the question.
Senator, in response to that, first of all, I'd like to say I don't have any confidence in you, and second of all, this is my question. You talked about...
Well, if I knew you better, it probably would be mutual. I just
Fine.
don't know you well enough.
Okay. This is the question, right? Now, my question is, Senator, you've spoken about how we've just been through the elections and you're calling for a non-party idea and so on and working together. I agree with that very much. I would now ask you to consider Senator Mansfield's proposals and ideas concerning defense spending a little more closely. The idea that out of every $100 that each American is required from each taxpayer, $37.50 goes to defense, while $7.50 goes to education. This goes on and on. I would ask you to consider those more closely. I believe those are much more accurate than the statistics you quoted to us. And also consider the great, huge cost overruns in defense and the waste that goes on in defense spending.
I stand by my statements. The defense budget is now, under the Democratic administrations, it ran as high as 60-odd%. Now, under Nixon, it's down to 36.5%.
All right, do we have a question on this side?
Senator Thurmond, I'd like to ask you a two-part question, if I may, please. First of all, don't you believe, or don't you agree with the analysis that the major cause of environmental pollution in this country is the unregulated private enterprise, powerful private enterprise, which is dumping pollution into the environment without being regulated by the government? And also you made the statement that the cost of the Vietnam War is being paid out of the defense budget, but I'd like to have your comments on the greatest cost of that war, which is not coming out of that budget, which is the cost in lives.
Last statement.
Could you repeat the last 2-3 words? It was hard to hear it up here.
I said I would like to know about the cost of the Vietnam War, which is not coming out of the defense budget, the greatest cost, which is the cost in lives.
I agree with you thoroughly. The greatest cost is cost in lives. We've lost 45,000 men there. And we wouldn't have done it. We wouldn't have lost those men there if we had used our air power and sea power immediately, if President Kennedy had used it, or if President Johnson had used it, to have very quickly won the war and wound it up and brought the men home. But they didn't do that. They merely fought a defensive war just as they fought in Korea, and it's gone on for 7 years. Don't forget, it started under Kennedy, it was carried on under Johnson, and Nixon is doing his best to bring it to a close.
Next question over here.
Yes, Senator Thurmond, I just wanted to make a note that in the time you've spoken, we've spent $1,367,370 on the war. That comes down to $758.80 per second. I don't wish to remain philanthropic about this, but my question is in relation to Senator Eastland getting $186,000 a year in farm subsidies and him also being a very powerful member in the Senate. Does this represent a conflict of interest?
Well, I can't speak for any other senator and his income. They all have to file a report up there in the Senate. It's turned over to the Senate, and a lot of it is public, and the income reports even have to be filed up there. And so any information you want, I'm sure if you're right, you can get it from up there. I'm not going to defend or prosecute any member of the Senate. That's not my purpose here today.
Next question.
Senator Thurmond, I'm glad I came today. There are a lot of things that I learned today that I don't think I knew before.
If you'll just share a little more conservative philosophy, you'll learn a lot more too.
I wanted to repeat a couple of the things in short form to make sure I understand you right and then ask my question. You said the strongest nation is the one that has the strongest military might. I didn't know that before. Not really. You said that we had to choose between defense, dollars for defense, and dollars for welfare, but somehow that I can't see in that the inherent implication that what we're really choosing is between death and life. You didn't really make that point clear, rather defense and welfare, like items on a budget. You talked about gaps. We heard about a lot of that in the last 15, 20 years. And you talked about...
Let's take one point at a time. Your point on the military. Yes, I think it's a misconception that a great many people feel throughout the world that the United States is the strongest military nation in the world. And I was pointing out to you that that is not necessarily so. The Soviet Union now has 1,400 intercontinental ballistic missiles. We have only 1,054. The Soviet Union has twice as many submarines as we do. The Soviet Union is building surface ships much faster than we are. The Soviet Union is making tremendous strides. And I was trying to point out to you, because some people feel we ought to just cut down on the military establishment, and I tell you, if you do, you'll be taken over by the communists.
Senator Thurmond, I am afraid, but I'm not afraid of the Russians, the North Vietnamese, and the Chinese military strength. I'm kind of afraid, and hear me out, I'm kind of afraid that people, I'm glad that we're listening to you, but I hope that that listening is about all we do. Under your analysis, the United States will surely die if we do not prepare ourselves to kill the world's population more than our already two-time over capability. Please tell us, following your analysis in the lecture, how anyone or any side can win. But first, stop and consider if we even recognize your picture of the world as more than a game.
Yes, I would say to you that if we have an all-out nuclear war with the Soviets, both sides will lose. Both sides are bound to lose because millions of people will be destroyed. But the way to avoid that confrontation, the way to avoid this all-out nuclear war is for the United States to remain strong militarily and not let the Soviets get the upper hand and become stronger than we are militarily. The only language they know is power. The only desire we have is peace. Therefore, we must remain strong.
Let's have another question from this side over here.
Senator Thurmond, I think you made some fallacies in your arguments. However, there's one thing that I think is true. I agree with you that crime causes poverty. I think that's important. And because I'm against poverty, I'm also against the crimes of capitalism and imperialism. I want to know why you're not equally consistent on this point.
Well, you sound like to me one who is opposed to the American form of government. If you do, I have nothing in common with you.
Let me finish it.
I am
Senator, you're
strongly
right.
in favor of the American form of government. The people in these United States have more material prosperity than all the rest of the 3 billion people in the world. The 6% of the people in the United States, and that's the only percentage of the world population, have more automobiles, more refrigerators, and more conveniences of all kinds than the rest of the world. On 7% of the land in the world, we produce more food than all the rest of the world put together. I have traveled over most of the world, and I can say to you, there's no nation under the sun where the people have as much material things, where they enjoy as much freedom and have as many opportunities as they do in the United States. And I am proud, I am indeed proud to be an American.
Let's have the next question from this side over here.
Mr. Thurmond, I'd like to commend you on the fact that you're one of the senators who is so fervently trying to defend our cities against nuclear attack. However, I submit to you that the Russians will never do it, since our cities are already being destroyed in riots, and our environment is already completely polluted, so a hydrogen bomb would do nothing to it already. I submit to you that the pollution and the destruction of our cities is a problem that is going on now, while a nuclear war is at best only a hypothetical situation, yet we are spending more on that hypothetical situation as we are on the now problem. Now I wonder why?
Yes, there have been many riots in the United States. There have been many demonstrations in the United States. And if you search out the leaders, the hardcore leaders of those demonstration riots, you'll see they generally have communist connections. A lot of innocent people, thousands of innocent people have been misled and have become involved in these things. But the hardcore leaders of most of these demonstrations and riots are either communist or they have communist connections or inspired by the communists.
I just noticed, Senator Thurmond, that you're wearing a Spiro Agnew watch.
That is correct. I have a Spiro Agnew watch. I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of it. I think Vice President Agnew has made a wonderful vice president. I think he's one of the greatest living Americans, and someday I would like to see him president. You also You also have a great American in this state, one of the finest men I've ever known, and one of the greatest living Americans is the governor of this state, Ronald Reagan.
All right. Hold on. Okay. Let's have. Yeah, we got time. Let's have a question over here.
Yeah, Mr. Thurmond.
Hey, look, we're not going to heckle the questions. You don't heckle the answers.
Yeah, Mr. Thurmond, I think you raised one problem where, in a way, you were really right on. When you were talking about the problem of securing convictions in certain criminal cases. And I think there's one particular problem we have here in California where we'd really be glad to bring our conviction rate up to 1 in 30. And this is a problem of certain types of murders of black and brown people unarmed by the police in this community. I refer specifically to the cases of like Leonard Deadweiler, Gregory Clark, Ruben Salazar, the Sanchez cousins and the like. And I would like to know what you think as, as some sort of positive change can be made to bring our conviction rate up in these sort of cases.
It is my judgment that all people should be treated equal and right, and I think the police should do that. And I have confidence in the police system of Los Angeles and the police system throughout the nation, and I think they will treat people equally and right.
Over here.
Senator, many of the critics of the American policy in Southeast Asia cite their stand on the basis of humanitarian principles. However, there are approximately 1 million refugees from North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The history of communist takeovers in Russia and North Vietnam indicates that it is invariably a bloodbath, as all potential people who might be against the regime are eliminated. In view of this, what do you, if the policy advocated by Alan Cranston and the senator-elect from California, namely cut and go, is instigated in Vietnam, what do you think will be the fate of these 1 million refugees? Shall we take them into the United States like the 500,000 Cubans that we have here, or where's the end?
I would first ask, why are there 1 million people from North Vietnam that have come to South Vietnam? I think that's a pretty good indication. I think that's a pretty good indication that the government of North Vietnam has brought tyranny to them, and they have come to South Vietnam to seek more freedom. And the facts I have is that the government of South Vietnam will help to protect them.
All right, let's take the next question over here.
Senator Thurmond, you expressed in the latter part of your monologue, you expressed disappointment about the penetration of government into the private lives of the citizens and the sort of regulation over the private lives of citizens. What I want to know is, did you vote for the recent crime bill that established the no-knock provision, and if so, how do you reconcile these positions?
Yes, I did, and I want to say that that was a tough decision to make, because it is a matter that has two sides to it. On the other hand, we were told by the law enforcement people of the nation, who ought to know that if you're going to catch these criminals who are peddling drugs, that you've got to rush in quickly in order to catch them in the act before they destroy the drugs. And that was the main reason, I think, not only the way I voted, but the way the majority of the Senate and the House of Representatives voted too.
All right, let's take the next question over on this side, please.
Good afternoon, Senator Thurmond. A lot of people have been talking about the need for defense spending to prevent the all-out nuclear holocaust. But what is the effect on having military superiority as far as negotiations are concerned? If we were in a weakened position at the negotiating table, say in the Mideast, as far as Israel, what would their chances of muscle power in the Mideast, of taking over Israel, of taking over Jordan, how would this be affected?
Well, in my judgment, we've got to remain the strongest nation in the world militarily if we're going to avoid an all-out nuclear holocaust with the Soviet Union. We know the Soviets have caused the trouble in the Mideast. We know the Soviets have provided the weapons and the missiles and the planes to Egypt and the other countries there that are fighting Israel. I'm not taking one side or the other in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but we must recognize that the Soviets, the communists, have provided the weapons and the planes and that have jeopardized Israel. And our country has pledged itself to sell planes to Israel, not to take sides in the matter, but simply to try to bring about a balance, so that when the Egyptians and the other Arabs know that Israel does have planes and can protect itself, then maybe they won't start a war. We are hoping that balance of weapons and equipment will help to prevent an all-out war in the Mideast.
Okay, could we have the next question over here, please?
Yes, Senator Thurmond, there are those who say that all the problems you've been talking about, crime, poverty, and so on, are a result of the fact that we have too many people. I'd like to ask you to express your views on overpopulation and whether you think that the views I just expressed have any merit.
Well, I haven't said it's caused from an overpopulation. I guess you or someone else did, but we do know the population is growing very fast, and I think it would be very helpful if education can be provided to all families, so that if they wish to provide for family planning and a limitation upon the number of the family, this can be done. There's no doubt about the population explosion is continuing, not only in this country, but throughout the world. And I feel sure that steps will be taken, and I hope those steps will be sensible and practical.
Let's have the next question over here, right? Right.
Senator, it's fairly well documented by now that you acted
Could you
as
speak
the-
up, please?
It's fairly well documented by now.
Even louder. It's still very difficult to hear up here.
It's in my throat. It's fairly well documented by now that you acted as the representative to hold the South in line for President Nixon in the 1968 Republican Convention. What I want to know is, do you regret that role? Would you do it again in the 72 convention if the president asked you to? And do you expect a kind of a Southern secession from the president in 72?
I do not regret having helped President Nixon in 1968 at the convention. I cannot say what position I shall take in 72. That's entirely too far off. I have been pleased with many of his actions, but I have been displeased with some of President Nixon's actions. I shall be running again myself in 1972, and I think the president's actions between now and 1972 would determine what course I would pursue at that time.
Okay, let's have the next question over here, please.
Okay, I believe you said somewhere in your speech that you were worried that the military unpreparedness may destroy the power of the United States. Now, I would like to know what you mean by power and what your obsession to power of the United States is. Why are you so obsessed with this power, this big?
I'm
this
so obsessed to
domination
keep
type
the
thing?
military of the United States strong for the reason that the communists have vowed to dominate the world. They have as their goal to take over the world, and the United States is the only free country in the world that can prevent this. The United States has a tremendous responsibility to keep strong militarily, because that's the only language the communists know. If we do not keep strong militarily, there's no other country in the world that can combat the Soviets, and therefore we must be the strongest nation in order to protect the free world.
We have time for about 2 more questions, one from each side.
Yes, Senator Thurmond, I'd like to ask you a question about the elections this year. It seems that in the South, the Republicans lost the governorships in Florida and Arkansas and did not pick up the Senate seats they wanted in Texas and Florida. And about the only significant victory they had was in the state of Tennessee, which is really a border state. Does this mean that President Nixon's Southern strategy has more or less failed this election?
In analyzing the election, it's true that the Republicans did lose the governorship in Florida, and they lost it in Arkansas. I think there are a lot of factors that enter into this thing. In other words, the unemployment throughout the country had something to do with it. The inflation had something to do with it. Mr. Nixon has brought down inflation. It is down. The record shows it's been coming down, but it's still high. And the fact that he's been trying to bring inflation down, and his government has felt it was necessary to increase interest rates and make money tight, this all affected the voters. Because personally, I like to see low interest rates, and I imagine most voters do, and a lot of voters voted against the government in power where interest rates are high and where money is tight and where there's some unemployment. Now, Mr. Nixon inherited a very bad situation. He's been trying to do what he thought was best, I'm sure. On the other hand, the policies that he had to take or did take have necessarily brought a repercussion from the voters.
Okay, we have to take our final question from this side, please.
In the state of South Carolina, I want to know what steps are being taken to bring to justice the people responsible for shooting in the backs 24 black students in Orangeburg, South Carolina.
I'm sure that I'm sure that the government of South Carolina is as zealous and anxious to punish criminals as the government of any other state in the nation. Our governor down there is Governor McNair. I'm sure that he could answer any question that you'd write to him about it. He is the governor, the chief law enforcement officer. On the other hand, the position that came out, the evidence that came out, I believe, was that the officers only fired in response to an attack upon them. I was not there, I don't know, but that's the information that came to us. And I feel sure that the people of South Carolina and the government of South Carolina will be fair to all people.
All right, thank you all very much. We have to leave now. Thank you. Bye.